Now, Yodit, you'll be working with lots of different organizations that will be using data for lots of different reasons. I wanted to ask you two questions, and you choose which order you do these in, right? And I suspect take the proper question first, which is what's the sort of the best use of your data that you've seen organizations do, and have you been able to witness kind of change off the back of your data? That'd be really interesting to look at. The other thing is, and just I guess for me, it's just about curiosity about where we've got to. When you get, once you've done that, tell us what is perhaps the most surprising, oddest, coolest, whatever way you want to frame it, piece of data that you guys collect as part of your thing, because I kind of get this impression as well. There's stuff being collected that no one has any idea about. And you sit there and go, wow, we've got that to that level. So perhaps start with a grown-up question first, and then follow up with my very childish question that just wants to look at shiny things and get excited.
Okay. And I agree. I think even as I've been dealing with data for 20 odd years, and people get really, really excited, but the hardest part is actually having all this stuff and no questions. The questions are the critical bits. What are we going to ask the data of? And then we can go, what data points do we need? And really I think, again, this is kind of the maturity conversation. As an industry matures, you see the initial excitement, and then you see kind of the use cases being bedded down. For example, if you, for those, pretty much everyone is obviously moving into kind of some bit of hybrid working. Great, you need data, you need to understand, how many desks, how much collaboration, so forth. But you also need to speak to your employees, right? Like, you need to ask them questions. And yes, you do surveys, but really kind of just taking a subsample and asking in-depth questions. And what are they not happy about, and so forth. Once you've got the direction in mind, you start framing the questions, and then you start running experiments. And I think that's the methodology is what I'm seeing people need to develop next. I think that's the next level of maturity, having kind of much more of a scientific mind, rather than I'll take this bucket of mess and I'll try to do some graphs, and then some answer will pop out, which is, it never happens that it never goes that way. So for me, I think we need to, as this industry moves forward, we need to talk much more and share best practices, and have some consistency in mind. If we get it right, I actually can see a world where people are happier, more productive, and also kind of the wastages that we've seen previously, and we're going to see going forward, if we don't change in the way that we approach it, would be minimized.
I just want to jump in there quickly, because there's something you said there about methodology, and I think that's really, really interesting, because I've heard people talk about that the whole workplace needs to be more scientific. And I always suspected the people that say that tend to be people that are selling you data solutions, right? And I think there's a tendency to think science equals data. And with our academic on the panel, who could probably do a whole webinar episode on its own about kind of some of the problematic viewpoint, because it's not as straightforward as that. One thing that always struck me about science is that, and comparing it to workplace projects, and tell me if you think this is sort of the thing you're kind of getting at, is that there are, in a total workplace experience, there's loads of levers that we can pull. There's loads of cogs that are turning. There's so many variables and factors that are going in. But quite normally, and Steph, I'm going to come to you shortly afterwards, because you've gone through, I think, something similar recently with big workplace change projects. You're changing all of it. You're changing everything. Now, if you were going to be very scientific, you would change parts of it and see what happens. You would go, right, we're going to just change this tiny variable, and we're going to start to understand the impact of that variable. But with workplace projects, there tends to be a lot of change all at the same time, and something might have worked. We don't know what, and we don't know how to keep an eye on it. And so is that kind of what you mean with, like, the methodology now needs to be the next evolution? Is it that kind of that kind of very structured approach to, this is why we collect it, this is how we collect it, this is what we do after we've collected it, here's how we use it. Is that what you're getting at?
Yes, and it's also recognizing that one data point in itself is not, it doesn't just work in a vacuum. So for example, people monitor CO2, but what we do know is actually, if you monitor CO2 at certain times versus when utilization is higher, utilization and CO2 are linked if your HVAC systems or your kind of air intake systems are not performing as well. So it's not just, let's just take a sample set. It is like for every person that comes in, how consistent is CO2?
Wow.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I guess what you're saying here is that if we start looking at data points in isolation, we might go, ooh, that's interesting. But what you're saying is that, and we're getting into, I can see Ian get very excited, because what we're getting into is kind of like the difference between causation and correlation, and all that sort of really exciting stuff. Now, I would worry that that brings in a kind of skills bit as well.